Now let us look at the Commissioner General. We've seen who the Commissioner General is, right? We've seen where he's reporting, his power to delegate his functions, right? Now let us look at what are his powers, right? What are his powers? So the Commissioner General is responsible for administration of the act, right? In other words, he has a lot of functions, right? Right? And the broader function is just basically making sure that the act is being administered, right? The tax law is being administered. So for him to basically achieve this function, which is basically administration of the tax, right? He must have power in order to achieve this, right? In order to achieve this. So the Commissioner General is given discretionary power under the law to make determination regarding the Taxation Act, the VAT Act, and the Custom and Excise Act. So they are referring to the power that he is given as discretionary power. What does the word discretionary power mean? Because when we're talking about discretion or discrete, it means freedom, right? Will, right? Option. In other words, has ability to make his own judgment, right? Has ability to make his own judgment. They are not just powers unoti azipanga zakuti ata umusankha munthu uyu. No. These are called discretionary because his powers give him the right to use his own judgment, right? Use his own judgment. It's not written somewhere kuti akwena azipanga is no. He can use his own judgment. He's not wrong, he's not right. It means that two commissioner generals at different points can basically give different conclusions or direct different, right? Because they're called discretionary powers, right? Power or freedom to make a decision, right? To make a judgment. So basically that's called discretionary power. That means if at all if there was a question to say what is discretionary power, I'm sure it's not gonna be pop up a question like what is discretionary power, but just basically that's it. That is the power that is given to the commissioner general, allowing him to make his own judgment or has a freedom to make judgment, right? There's freedom to make his own judgment. That's what discretionary power. So he has discretionary power under the law to make determination regarding these different areas: taxation, VAT, and custom and exercise. So let us look at the discretionary powers that we're talking about, right? What are his discretionary powers, right? So the following are some of the Commissioners General's discretionary powers are set out in the Taxation Act, right? Taxation Act. So the first one is basically to decide whether timber has been grown as timber for sale or not. Anthu ngati munazala timber wambirimbiri, right, in a forest, he can actually determine kuti okay, uyuyu munamuzalira muyu inuyo anali for sale or it was not for sale. He can make that decision. Discretionary power. He has the right to make a decision in such a case, right? Approval of deduction of bad debts. We know in accounting, we can basically say now the other debtors will never going to pay us. Other debtors will never going to pay us. So in accounting, that's an expense, right? Right? But for tax purposes, and when so he has the power to determine if that bad debt should be allowed for tax purposes. Bad debt. So he has the power to determine if a bad debt should be deducted. Right? He also has the power to determine the taxable income from export allowance is deducted, right? So he has that power to make a determination of taxable income from export allowance is deducted. So we are looking at exports that we'll look at in detail. So they're asking, can we deduct this exports allowance? It doesn't really make sense right now, but when we look at the exports, right? Right, exercise student and whatnot, that chapter, right? We'll see that export, right, has an deductible allowance, right? Has a deductible allowance. He's the one that makes that what determination. Another thing is basically the determination of allowable deduction against assessable income arising from the sale of timber, right? So he's also going to make that determination, right? So we know that not all expenses are allowed for deduction, because if all expenses were allowed for deduction, it would mean that people would be including expenses which will just reduce the amount of tax paid. So we have allowable deductions and non-allowable deduction. So he is the one that can determine that this is allowable for deduction, right, when it comes to sale of timber. Right, that's basically what that point is all about. Right, another power that he has is basically to decide whether a change in shareholding of a company has been effected to take advantage of assessable losses or not. So, as we proceed with this chapter, right, or rather not this chapter, but this course, will come a stage where we will look at the losses of a company, right, or losses of a business, right? Losses of a business are allowable deductions, right? It means that if, for example, last year I made loss of 20,000, and this year I make a profit of 100,000, it means I'm allowed to subtract 20,000 before I can calculate my tax to be paid. That's what it means. So this power that he has is to make sure that he's deciding whether the change of shareholding, right, has been done to affect, to take advantage of this loss. Because it's possible a company, right, a company A is a profit making, makes millions, maybe 100 million, right? Maybe what he can do, right, buy a company which is loss making, company B, right, so that he takes up all their losses. For example, he buys that company that is loss making, maybe 50 million. What their intention of buying this company, although it's loss making, is to make sure that it nets off with their profit, and they only pay on the remaining 50,000 the tax. So they're only buying this company to take advantage of these losses, right? So the Commissioner General can be able to assess, right? Is the change in ownership of the company, is it legit, or are they just trying to avoid paying taxes? That's to do with the power of discretion in terms of changing of shareholding, right? Another power that he has is basically a provisional acceptable basis of inventory value. He can determine which one is the acceptable inventory value. Is it the FIFO? Is it the LIFO? Is it the AVICO? Is it the standard cost, right? So he has the power to determine what is the acceptable inventory valuation method. Another thing that we should look at is the power that he has is basically accepting accounts prepared to date other than 30 June for assessment. The year of assessment of a company is 30 June, right? Like in terms of tax assessment, when it comes to the MRA, is 30 June, right? They might have switched it now to April, right? But as I said, we will stick to the manual, right? We'll stick to the manual because that's what the examiner said. They will mark you based on the manual. So we'll stick to the 30 June. So the year of assessment tax is basically what? 30 June. right? So everyone has to make sure that by 30 June, he has filed all his returns. But for whatever reason, a business might fail to what? To file it by 30 June. Maybe they have gone until July, right? July. So he has that power to accept, right? Accept any returns or assessments, right, that has been submitted after the date of assessment, which is 30 June. So hata kumva nkhani yanu ngati company ndikumvesesani kuti okay, for that reason we're gonna accept. We're not going to penalize you. You're not gonna pay any penalties because he has what? That power to accept accounts prepared to date other than 30 June. Maana he can use judgment. Okay, ndakumvesesani mmene fotokozeramo. We're not gonna penalize you for bringing what? The assessment later than 30 June. Another thing is determination of taxable income for non-exempt producers or cooperatives. So we'll also look at cooperatives, right? Which are basically non-governmental organizations, or let me just say some grouping, right? Right? Some grouping, social grouping, rather not social, but coming together of people so that they help each other in terms of production. I think so. Producers cooperatives, right? There are a lot of cooperatives that can be there. Inasako, credit cooperatives, right? So basically, people join in and sort of make up a company. It's not really a company, but it's in the form of a cooperative. So what the Commissioner General is doing here is basically determining how much is the taxable income for these non-exempt producers cooperatives. So he also had that power. He also has the power to reduce or waive penalties for non-payment of provisional tax. So he also has that power. Kuona kuti situation ichonchi and telling you kuna kuti we have waived it. Imagine taija ya corona ija zinthu zinavuta, right? Companies were failing to pay taxes because everything was not okay, right? So you are allowed as a Commissioner General to say that, all right, because of the situation, I've waived your penalty and you are not supposed to pay. So basically, he has that power as the Commissioner General. He also has that power to extend the time to pay tax and the payment of penalties. He also has those powers as the Commissioner General. And lastly, he has the power to determine the rate of annual allowance, right? Some of these will make sense as we go along, but you should know that these are his discretional power as stated in the Taxation Act. Now let us look at secrecy. This is basically section 6 of the Act, right? Taxation Act. So let us look at what secrecy is all about. It's coming from a word secret. So we know that tax information is considered confidential and private to the taxpayer. So it means every company have to produce their financial statement and give them to MRA so that they make assessment of how much tax that company has to pay, right? So it's like they are coming into contact with information that is confidential of taxpayer, right? So these officers, right, come into contact with such confidential information of taxpayers, right? So any information relating to one taxpayer may be used to the advantage of a competitor. For example, I see information for TNM, right? In Gomezero Kugau Sajan Aku Airtel, right? Up Airtel, right? So it means that it's like they have had an advantage over their competitor because of what? This information. Because of this information. So because of that reason, you are supposed to make sure that you keep this information confidential, right? Confidential. That's where secrecy is coming about. So if not properly used, tax information can put a taxpayer in a bad light with the government and the public, right? If not used properly, the tax information can put a taxpayer in bad light with the government and the public. So, any person that is carrying duty under the Taxation Act therefore requires to observe secrecy. It means that any officer of the MRA has to observe secrecy. When you talk about secrecy, we're saying that a person is not supposed to reveal any matter that comes to his attention or his knowledge in performance of his duties under the Act. So any information that he has acquired as he was actually undertaking his duties, right, under the Act, he's not supposed to disclose to anyone, right? And they have to what? Observe the secrecy, right? The secrecy. So that's to do with it, right? Any person, including the Commissioner General, right? Ngekuti Commissioner General ona zina zake, right? Sikuti kumowa kwene azikaulula kuti komatu tiyenemu chakuti chakuti atalezera ni mlandu umenewo, right? They are supposed to observe the secrecy under section 6, right? So before any officer of MRA, right, takes up office, including the Commissioner General, right? Any officer of MRA, including the Commissioner General, before taking office, is required to make an oath of secrecy. Kulumbira pamaso pa magistrate or the commissioner, right? Right? He is supposed to vow that he will keep any information that he acquires during his stay at the office, right, a secret. What it means is that atapezeka kuti akunena zimenezo kumowa auza akazi ake ndipo anthu ena ake apangidwa affect, right, he can be sued because he made an oath in front of the magistrate, right? So every person is supposed to make sure that he makes this oath of secrecy. Oath of secrecy. Right. So basically that's it. So let us look at some penalties, right? That are relating to the oath of secrecy and basically secrecy in general. So any person that takes up an office before taking an oath of secrecy will be liable of a fine of 20 kwacha. I know it's unrealistic, right? It's unrealistic. The bad thing is that I think these laws were enacted long time ago and they have not been amended. So that's why seems unrealistic. Because 20 kwacha ndijani, right? Even mwana panopa cannot accept 20 kwacha because sangachite kanthu. You can't even buy a sweet with 20 kwacha. So a fine of not taking an oath of secrecy when you start work, just 20 kwacha, is just unrealistic. They are supposed to revise it. Unfortunately, they have not. But for the sake of the exam, right? For the sake of the exam, we'll assume that it is indeed 20 kwacha if you do not take the oath of secrecy before starting your job. And also, if a person who has, at the beginning of starting his job, taken the oath of secrecy, but chooses to reveal any information that he acquires during his work, right, to any person, is also liable to an offense that is fined at 1,000 kwacha. So mukagwidwa mukunena kandi kumowa kamgawo zaka zanu ndi za gudubuka, right, you are supposed to pay an amount of 1,000 kwacha. 1,000 kwacha as a fine. And also on top of that, you'll be imprisoned for 2 years. You can imagine, right? So you can imagine 1,000 ngara kuipangaso tali ndi 2 years imprisonment. It means kale 1,000 it was a huge punishment, right? But right now it's just immaterial, 1,000 kwacha. but still the punishment, for the sake of the exam, we'll assume is such, right? For the sake of the exam, we'll assume the punishment for revealing information, right, after taking the oath of secrecy is 1,002 years in prison, right? But where you reveal information before you take the oath of secrecy, you're not liable to that offense because sooner lumbire now, sooner lumbire now. But you're still liable to the offense of taking office without making this oath of secrecy, which is basically fined by 20 kwacha. It's not 20,000, it's not a mistake, it's 20 kwacha. So it is important to note that requirements to observe secrecy applies to all officers of MRA and all staff from public service who need access to MRA files. So all MRA officers have to take or up with or observe the secrecy, right? Secrecy rule, and any person of public, right, that has access to MRA files also has to what? Make sure that he takes or vows to keep information secret, right? That's to do with secrecy. But however, in this chapter and the rest of the syllabus in tax, all the examples that are considered are from the Taxation Act, right? We're not going outside the Taxation Act. All of them are within the Taxation. So you must make sure that you take notes of that. So let us look at what are the exceptions to the rule of secrecy. We're saying that we're supposed to make sure that all information acquired in the course of our duty as taxmen, right, are supposed to be kept secret, right? Do not, basically, do not disclose this information, right? Do not disclose this information. So the first exception to the rule is basically what information is required by the Auditor General or any officer duly authorized by him in the course of carrying out his duty. So the Auditor General is basically the big boss, right, at the National Audit Office now, right? The National Audit Office. Office imene mapanga audit or government departments and agencies, right? Or government departments and agencies. So this department, the now, right, headed by the Auditor General, right, does that. So because he needs the information for use, right? He needs the information for his audit, right? He might request information from MRA and you are mandated to give them, right? Because he is basically using it to carry out his duty. And it means the rule of secrecy will not apply there. Another thing is where the information is required by authorized government officials for another country which has double taxation agreement with Malawi to evaluate the assessment, the tax position of a taxpayer. So as we further proceed with the course, we'll look at what double taxation is, right? Double tax, right? Double tax happens where because of the tax laws of different countries, a taxpayer has been affected and paid twice, right? We'll see what these tax laws of Malawi apply, right? But it might be possible that in Malawi, our tax law says that any money, right? Any money generated for working in Malawi, right, has to be taxed. It means that an expatriate, when I talk about an expatriate, we're saying a person ochokera kunja akuzagwira ku Malawi. It means any money that he generates, right, will have to be taxed, right? But if the expatriate is coming from, let's say, from the UK, right, and that country says that every citizen of Malawi, every citizen of this country has to be taxed despite or regardless of where he is, it means that this person also has to pay tax to UK. it means he is paying twice. That's double taxation, right? So, to make sure that people do not suffer, countries might enter into what? Tax arrangements, right? Kuti, they should basically what? Exempt, he must be exempted from tax in one country. So for that reason, for example, a tax person from UK can ask information about one expatriate working in Malawi for information so that they make assessment of how much tax, right, should be assessed. That's basically it. So you can be allowed to give them information. It's not what? It's not an offense, right? Under the secret law, it's an exception. That's to do with that. So another exception is that where the information is required by the taxpayer, right? That's also not an offense or an agent of the taxpayer. So if the taxpayer comes to MRA and asks kuti ndikufuna information anga iyi, you can easily give it, or his agent, it's not an offense. Another exception is where the commissioner wishes to compile and publish statistics about a total amount of income received by any class of persons as declared in the returns to commissioner. So what we're saying is, if the taxpayer wishes to make some compilations and publish statistics, that's not also an offense, right? Giving the commissioner this information. So where information is required for the purpose of carrying out the act into effect for the purpose of any prosecution of an offense committed in relation to the tax matter. What he's saying is, where this information is being required at court, where a person is being persecuted or being charged of an offense relating to tax, you can go to the court, produce the information, and this exception applies to such a situation, right? So a person is being persecuted relating to tax, you can bring the information to the court and you will not be held liable for breach of the secrecy rule. Now, let us look at communication with the taxpayer. How does the MRA communicate with the taxpayer? And so on and so forth. So, the MRA will communicate to the taxpayer using documents like notices and so on and so forth, right? So, but for each company, not any business, not any individual, but each company, like each company has appointed a public officer who is responsible for ensuring that all tax matters are dealt with. So, for example, a company like Airtel Malawi, right, has to appoint a person, right, who is usually a tax expert or an accountant, right, tax expert or an accountant, right, to be this person called the public officer. So this public officer is just basically a representative of the company and is responsible for dealing with anything to do with tax compliance and whatnot, right? So that's basically that case. So in terms of such a situation, all notices, right, all assessments, all returns by MRA are delivered to this person, this public officer at his office. As I said, this public officer is not an employee of MRA, but the employee of the company under question. So he's the one that actually receives all the notices or the assessments from MRA. So let us look at situations where it is deemed that a person has received communication, right? Or a person has received notice or communication from MRA. How can we say now a person is deemed to have received the information, right? So these are the situation. If MRA personally gives him the notice, he is deemed to have been what? Right? Served the information or given the information or given the notice or given the communication. Right? Pompasa document pamanja, he is deemed kuti munthu walandira communication. Ndipo sangazakaneso. 1. 2. Left with an ordered person who is resident at his last known place of adobe, office, or place of business. So, for example, munthu wakuimarayo wapita kunyumba kwa public officer wa Airtel. Address imene anasiye it, right? This is basically the public officer. Public officer. Aimarayo apita kumeneko, koma sanakapezeko ndani? Sanakampezeko yeye, koma wapezapo akazi ake. Kapena any other person. And he has received the notice. He is deemed to have what? Received the notice. Kwa atapeza kuti munthu wakuimarayo wapeza akamwana, right? Ndipo timadziwa kuti malamulo it's under 16, I think so. If not under 18, it's deemed kuti amene ndi minor, right? It means that atata kuti anapasa notice imeneyi munthu ameneyi. It means that chitati chasowa sinampeza uyoyo, he can defend kuna kuti notice yanuyo sinalandira watana kuti lero nampasa mwana wakwanu. Nah, that's not allowed. But if walandira is an adult and kunyumba kwake, adobe just means residence, place of residence, dwelling place, right? Office or place of residence or place of business, right? He is deemed to have received that, the communication. Another situation is basically where the notice is sent by post address to such last known place of adobe, office, or place of business. So if that remises into a post, right? That remises into a post office, kwa address imene munatipasa ngati ku MRA, right? Kaya ku office ndikatumiza, you are deemed to have received the what? The notice. Olana kuti kala so chifukwa cha anthu aku post office, you are still deemed to have received a notice. Right? And lastly, affixed at the last known place of adobe, office, or place of business, and the person will be deemed to have received the notice on the 14th day of after affixing. Affixing is just basically attaching or kakukoma. So for example, I go to your office, I find kuti kulibe aliyense, right? So because of that, ndangojisiya chapa chiseko or ndachilowekesa pansi kana ndachipanga attach pa chiseko ma document iyo. Notice ndaipanga attach pa chiseko, right? You are deemed to receive this notice after 14 days, right? After 14 days. So pakadusa 14 days, you are deemed to have received the communication. Within 14 days, you are not deemed to have received the communication, right? That means ngati ndapita kwanu kachisiya sinampasiye munthu aliyese, right? It has to go 14 days, then you are deemed to have received it. So we have seen situations where person is deemed to have received communication, right? Received communication. But one thing we should note, right, is that the above points that we have just looked at will not apply if the officer is satisfied that such a person would not understand the meaning of the notice due to literacy or infirmity. In other words, sickness, right? So if a person, you are satisfied that this person is illiterate or is sick, right, incapacitated, then it's not, the above points do not really apply, right? So in that case, the officer then may direct that such information to communicate to such a person in a manner he deemed fit. So we're talking about this officer being officer of MRA, not the public officer. So if the public officer goes to kwasiya notice kwamba ukaziwa kuti munthu yuti akuoneka ngati is illiterate, I don't know, for whatever reason, right? Or he looks very sick, singamusire, man, it means that those do not apply, right? Even if you give him by hand, it does not apply, right? it does not apply, and he has to make sure that he deems it fit to give it to somebody who is capable of receiving the notice. So that's basically the end of the chapter. Thank you.